name is Katie Sanders. I'm at the University of Georgia. I'd like to thank Allison, Fortner, my co-author here, and Dr. Lamm for support on this project. So a little bit of background. I have been able to lead a class about international agricultural development 2 times during my tenure as a doctoral student. And this previous iteration, I wanted to really bridge my research interest in identity and seeing it used as a pedagogical technique for helping students see themselves within international agricultural development. So there is a need for intercultural development in higher education across disciplines, but especially in agriculture, as we're facing an increasingly globalized food system. But one of the primary barriers to effective cross-cultural communication is actually a lack of self-awareness of one's own culture. And so we wanted to find a way to help students articulate their own identity so that they could create a framework for relating to themselves so that they can understand how others relate to their own culture. So there's a need for pedagogical strategies to help students reflect upon and learn about the self. We selected body mapping as the technique, and it's a visual methodology that emphasizes the participants' awareness of their own embodied experiences. These embodied experiences are related to identity, place, and belonging. It's a socially constructed method which focuses on the recognition of difference and sociocultural constructions of identity. It's a way to facilitate reflection and meaning-making about students' lived experiences and how that influences their identity as a student and as a person. And arts-based methods have been used in international agricultural development research, but in our field specifically, we see a lot of use of photographs. We've heard photo voice, photo journal, and we see that specifically with field work, service learning, and intercultural learning. But very few arts-based methods beyond photographs have been used to kind of investigate how can we use visual methodologies to advance our research. You can see at the top here one example of a body map that we use in this study. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be a body or a stick figure. It can be different symbols that students choose to represent themselves. For our theoretical framework, we use the semiotic theory, which is the study of signs and the theory of the production and interpretation of meaning. There are 3 types of semiotic signs that exist within the theory. We have iconic, indexical, and symbolic. And these are ways of differentiating levels of abstraction used in symbols and how they relate to our own cultural knowledge. So iconic symbols are the most basic and foundational form of signs that we use. So here we see a bicycle. And the bicycle doesn't represent anything else except for a mode of transportation. A bicycle is a bicycle is a bicycle. So there's no abstraction that we have to do to understand what this symbol is representing. But if we move to indexical, it's a one level more of abstraction for our signs. We look at this and we know that if we eat this or consume this, we could turn into that skull and crossbones or die. On a less morbid note, you may see a spoon and a fork as a symbol for somewhere that you can eat. This symbol has a logical connection to what it represents. It's just a single level of abstraction further from its actual physical form. And then finally, we have symbolic signs. And these are signs that have no logical connection to what they represent, but are in fact entirely socially and culturally constructed. We look at this and we know it's an indicator of health. But nothing about the sign itself logically connects to health itself beyond their own cultural construction. So the purpose of this study was to use body mapping as a method of articulating different aspects of the self as a component of intercultural competence development for students in an international development class. The first research questions was, how do students make sense of their identity? How do students make sense of how others perceive their identity? So not only how do they identify themselves, but what are their reflections upon how others are viewing them? And how does that influence how they define themselves in relation to international agricultural development work? So the students in this this project, some it was their first exposure to international education content, and others were more familiar with it. So this was a great exercise to get them thinking about the role that they play in international development. So I've talked a bit about the context, this IAD class. It was a mixed course of undergrads and graduates. And when asked to do the body mapping activity, they were presented with 3 prompts. For each prompt, they drew one body map and a narrative explaining why they chose the icons that they included in their body map and what the body map means. So the first question was, how do you identify yourself? The second was, how do others identify you? And then how do you see yourself in relation to IAD? We conducted both a semiotic analysis first of the images in the body maps, and we did this without reading the narratives first. So we wanted to see what semiotic meaning could we make out of students' body maps. And then we conducted a thematic analysis of the narratives and triangulated those 2 forms of analysis to see what we could learn about students' identity. We also conducted researcher memoing through the process to be aware of my own interpretations of their identities through the semiotic analysis, and conducted member checks, triangulation, and a peer debrief to enhance the trustworthiness of the data. From the thematic analysis, we identified six themes across the 3 research questions. This was gender and sexuality, family and the social self, heritage, self as academic, tensions within one's identity, and the impact of identity categorization. So I'm going to examine these 6 themes in the context of each research question. But first, here's an example of how I conducted the semiotic analysis. You can see on the left one image of a body map. My first mode of analysis was what iconic or non-abstracted symbols are being used in the body map. Then I moved to how are these iconic symbols abstracted 1 degree to make meaning of their own identity. And then finally, what are the symbolic or socially and culturally learned implications of the images used in their body maps. So again, we conducted the semiotic analysis first, and then moved into the thematic analysis of associated areas. So with this same image, you can see that in the narrative, this student talked about the importance of family and the social self, as well as heritage, of influencing who he is today. He decided to use the words familia and amor because he has Mexican and Cuban heritage, and that is the language that he felt most closely connected to. So these themes were highly convergent with the semiotic analysis. This is another question of how do you see yourself. It's a bit difficult to see. I encourage the use of colored pencils, but we worked with what we got. And so we saw influences of gender and sexuality, heritage again, but then emerging from both the semiotic analysis and the narrative analysis, I saw an emerging tension within different aspects of this student's identity. She talked about her Nigerian culture, how it shaped her personality and who she was, for better or for worse, and how this had a bit of a tension with her identification as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. So we can see a bit here how the semiotic analysis allowed us to identify these tensions within the identity that were indicated at a surface level, but not deeply reflected upon by the student. Then we move to how do others see you? And again, students drew 3 body maps each with 3 narratives each in response to each prompt. Here we can see the impact of identity categorization by others, as well as tensions within identity again. This student had a dual heritage of being Brazilian, but being born in the United States, but feeling like an imposter connecting to her Brazilian heritage because, in her words, she had no identifying features that would make her seem foreign or Brazilian, and she used the phrase feeling like a basic white girl and having this imposter fear of connecting with a certain category or label or identity. She felt they were very rigid modes of identity and not a lot of potential for hybrid identity classifications. And then finally, how do you see yourself within international agricultural development? identified with the self as academic. So this student talked about how he sees himself as an academic, but rather than replicating potentially problematic scholars who made contextually inappropriate conclusions from his work, he wanted to open himself up for criticism for the Western academic upbringing and the assumptions that come with that in an international space. I wanted to read this quote because I think it really highlights the impact of this technique in an international setting class. This activity has helped me to understand the ways in which my identity shapes my actions, and how I perceive others identify me also shapes those actions. Considering identity is crucial when conducting international development work because it helps us understand the complexity of people with whom we're working. Identities shape our actions, reactions, prejudices, and personal stories. Finding common identities can help connect us, but separate identities can help shape a true understanding of culturally appropriate solutions to the world's wicked problems. We see this student reflecting a bit on the IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory, because most of us, our default response to cultural difference is finding similarities to engage with. But in order to be culturally competent and move along that continuum, it's important to have an equal appreciation of cultural difference, because within the differences is where we can get defensive and limit our intercultural communication. Some conclusions from the analysis is that there was a high convergence between the semiotic analysis and the narrative or thematic analyses. The narrative analysis helped expand the semiotic analysis, especially for students whose drawings only contained a few icons. But there were some semiotic analyses that identified those potential tensions between students' identities that they alluded to, but may not have directly expressed. And these tensions often occurred between competing parts of one's identity, as we saw with a student who was both Nigerian and a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. And also in this comparison of self-identity or internally constructed identity with how others perceive them or an externally imposed identity, which can often be in conflict, especially when we're working with communities. The semiotic analysis expanded this narrative by identifying the symbolic power of icons for meaning making within identity construction. So some key findings are that the triangulation demonstrated how students constructed their own identities. Without the triangulation, we would have missed a really holistic and nuanced way of understanding students' meaning making of their own identity. The narrative helped us see this meaning making, while the semiotic drawings themselves help students distill and reflect upon their own sociocultural context and how they exist in different settings. And intercultural development was a course outcome, and this is actually a technique used in conjunction with the IDI. So if you're familiar with the IDI, you have your workbook, but this was something that we used to help them really refine that identity as an expansion of cultural identity. So body mapping can help students articulate a sociocultural identity, which can sometimes be difficult for Western students who have stayed within fairly homogenous communities during their lives. It's necessary for an interculturally competent workforce that we find strategies not only to help students appreciate cultural difference, but be able to articulate and understand themselves within a whole cultural context. And finally, if we conduct body mapping exercises at both the beginning and the conclusion of the course, we can kind of capture some of that intercultural development that is possible to happen within a semester. We did it just as an end of the course reflection, but I would love to see that comparison. And I think it's a great addition, if you're using the IDI at all, to get some arts-based and different ways of thinking and knowing to get your students to reflect. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, let's start the discussion. This time. Okay. It appears to me that perhaps this would be more valuable or more useful for an introvert than it would an extrovert. That I didn't see any indication that for extroverts there would be any socialization with other people. say, how do you identify me? Or how should I identify myself? Let me tell you what I see for you. Did you? And so that would just be one kind of thing where people might differ in how they respond to this. I took this to be a very personal kind of thing.
Yes, it is. I think that's interesting that you raised that point because extroverts, yes, may have more socialized activities for encountering difference. That does not necessarily mean that there is critical reflection of their own reaction to that difference. So I think by having this introspective moment to really distill what that identity is to you in a visual manner makes you think about yourself not narratively, but visually and artistically, and that engages a different way of thinking in your brain. But I think, expanding on what you suggested, if we were to do some sort of reflective activity after they've done the personal introspective reflection to see how others may react to their own identities, would be really interesting to see. The only caveat there is that this can be a very vulnerable process for certain students. I've had to mentor me through because they realized some things about themselves that they had never been brought to the surface before, and it was a very emotional experience. So it's just something you have to approach with caution and tweak a little bit differently based on the personality of the classroom.
Yeah, so the intervention was really the whole course leading up to that. This was at the end of the course?
It was. So they had a lot of language to be able to describe cultural difference at this point, which you can see in the narratives, which again, it would be interesting to capture at the beginning and the end of the course as an outcome of intercultural development.
What are your questions or thoughts?
You said these were a mix of undergraduates and graduate students.
Yes, from across disciplines. We had a lot of agricultural, ALEC students, but we also had students from Latin American and Caribbean studies, international policy, international relations, and some bench science students who definitely were like, why are you making me draw like I'm in kindergarten? So there were some barriers there with people who weren't so engaged in qualitative research, but we got there.
Yeah.
So this was used in classroom setting. I work in community studies, so community coalitions, things like that. Can you see something like this being used in those settings?
I absolutely do. I think it's a great way to do community-engaged research. So if you're working with coalitions, maybe you have someone draw a body map of their role on the coalition, and then maybe their role in the community. Because those could be different, and it can help you really analyze who are the people that I'm using as my contact to the community. How do they see themselves in relation to the community? And what can this visual technique tell me about maybe what I'm missing in these informal or formal conversations because I'm bringing an arts-based way of knowing? Yeah?
I guess building on that with different populations, do you have to tailor the methods depending on the age group? So like would you have to change things if you were going to do this with elementary school students versus young adults?
Yeah, definitely. This was highly developed for an international ag context because they wanted to think about themselves in international ag, even if they haven't had an experience internationally. But it would be great to do with younger kids to think, like, if you're in an agricultural class, like, draw a picture of you in a field, or draw a picture of you engaging with plants. You can tailor it a lot of different ways. You can abstract it more up. You can do it for a non-agricultural audience. You can do it for a domestic audience, even to think about their own relations within homogenous groups. So I think it's a really flexible method that can easily be tailored in those prompts. You can add narrative to it, you can take it away if it's a younger group. But that's what I like about it, is the flexibility.
You mentioned the IDI. Did you make the students take the IDI?
I did.
Okay, do they only take it one time or?
So they took it one time at the beginning of the course so that they could get their workbook. In my IDI training, we were cautioned not to use it as a benchmark for seeing change over a semester. And because we didn't have a heavy experiential intervention, I did not think it was worth the cost to do a pre-post IDI. But if I had been able to take them on an experiential learning or an international experience, I may have actually done a pre-post IDI.
What was the average? Like,
The average-
main section, like?
The average, like most IDI, was most rate minimization,
Yeah.
but I had students across the board. I had a high level of polarization reversal, so being defensive of other cultures and criticizing your own culture more. I had a lot of minimization, and then with my students who were predominantly non-white US backgrounds, they were primarily in adaptation and acceptance.
That's your.
All right, thank y'all so much.